Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. At least that covers all the bases. I don't know if this is something that happens in your home or maybe in your circle of friends where there's a particular word that's banned, that's banished, or that's taboo. It's not allowed to be said. And I'm not talking about swear words necessarily, although those are good words to be banished or bad words, depending which way you look at it. I'm talking about everyday kind of words, or perhaps even a place name, or maybe even a person's name. Let me give you some hypothetical examples. Perhaps you've gone on holiday as a family down to the coast, but halfway you stop at Harry Smith's like we all do, and then something embarrassing happened there, or awkward or frustrating happened. So now as a family you decide we don't mention Harry Smith at all, we just keep it to that place. We call it that place. Or perhaps mom tried to impress the in-laws a couple of years ago and burnt the turkey for Christmas. So to protect mom, we don't say turkey or in-laws in the same sentence at all. Maybe in some homes you don't say in-laws, you rather just say outlaws. There's another example. Or maybe you've got teenage kids who have latched onto a slang word and they just love to use that word in every single sentence, and it's driving you nuts. So as parents, you decide, that's it, we're done with that word. If we hear it, $10 for every time you mention that word. Some kind of word that's just been banned. Now I'll share a family secret with you. We have a particular, fairly common word that is banned in our home. You say, what word is that? Unfair. This word, unfair. And the reason for that is, well, several years ago when my teenage girls were back in primary school, early primary school, you know what young kids are like when it comes to this whole concept of unfair. Oh my goodness, life is just so unfair, and they will love to tell you when that's supposedly unfair, and they're going to tell you. And you know what it's like, you might buy one of them a jersey and then the next one's protesting, that's unfair. Or you ask them, please take the dishes to the kitchen, and suddenly that's unfair. They did it a year ago once. Or perhaps we're going to Butlas on holiday, and the other family or other members of our friendship group are going to Europe, and suddenly that's super unfair. Or the teacher gives them homework, and oh my goodness, that's so unfair. So after hearing that word, just one too many, I sat them down and I said, okay, girls, we've got a new strange rule in this house. The word unfair is banned. It's banished. And then I went on to explain to them the reason, because life is unfair. And the quicker they get used to that and navigate that and make peace with that, the better for themselves, the more success they're going to make out of life. So there we go. We banned the word unfair. But the other day, I started thinking, perhaps I need to bring that word back into our home, but for a very different purpose, very different reason. You see, I want the girls to really treat people unfairly. And I want my girls to see my wife and I treating people unfairly. And I want all of us as a family to approach life with an unfair attitude. And I know you're sitting there thinking, Mark, why on earth would you want to treat people unfairly? Why on earth are you saying that you want to have an attitude of unfairness? Maybe, Mark, you're not quite understanding this preaching concept. Maybe you should run those messages via Leonard just to check them out. You're supposed to be helping us. Why on earth would you say that? Well, the reason I would say that, it's just a different way of saying treating people with grace. Approaching life with grace, having an attitude of grace. Why do I say that? What is the basic elementary definition of grace? It's getting something, it's receiving something that's undeserved. That's unfair. That's the definition of grace. That's what makes grace so amazing. And if you think about it, that's how God deals with us. Permanently, unfairly. Permanently. If you read this story, it's a story of Him dealing with us in a manner that is unfair, full of grace. In fact, we're just stepping into such a precious season where we do what? We celebrate one of the most unfair things that ever happened, where God became one of us. God deals with us unfairly, with grace. So I want to look today at a particular parable where it really just highlights the unfairness of grace. And if you think about it, there's a couple of parables we could have chosen from Jesus. This one, I think, is just really good, and I think it highlights the point so well. And you can read it for yourself in Matthew chapter 20. It's right in the beginning of that chapter. But what we're going to do is I'm going to just tell it to you with a 21st century slant, and we're going to even put in a bit of a South African flavor just for fun. And I think it's going to highlight just how unfair grace can be at times. So let's start with an individual by the name of Chris. Chris is a shrewd, successful businessman, and he knows how to grab opportunities when he sees them. So Chris purchases a beautiful piece of property just outside of Kempton Park here, a vacant plot, as it were. And here's the plan. He's going to put up tunnels, and he's going to grow some organic veggies, because, that's the big thing, the big craze at the moment, huge demand from Woolies. The only problem is this land that he's just bought, this beautiful 5 acres, is one of those typical rundown plots. There is just tires everywhere and broken bricks and khaki boss and blackjacks and the kukuyus up to your knees. So it's a bit of a mess. So he decides on a Monday morning, really early, he takes his bakkie and he drives up Dan Road, and he stops at the top of Dan Road to go and fetch some of those guys that are waiting for a piece job or a casual job, the job that they just get, randomly, kind of hoping to get something so they can feed their families. So he pulls over, and you've seen this scenario happen before. He pulls up with his Hilux bakkie. He doesn't know the Rangers better, but that's a whole different story. So he pulls up with his Hilux bakkie, and you know what it's like. It's chaos, and guys come running and whistling. It's almost like a feeding frenzy in a Japanese koi pond. And these guys are bailing into the back of the bakkie, and 10 of them manage to get on. And he's super excited. Chris says, "Hey guys, I've got a job for you for the day, and you happy with $300?" And they are more than happy. That's more than enough, more than they in fact used to. So off they go, 6 o'clock in the morning. By the time they get dropped off at the plot, it's close to 7 o'clock, and he gives them weed eaters and pangas and tools and all sorts of things, and they get stuck in starting to clear this property because those tunnels arrive tomorrow morning first thing. So what Chris does is he goes back into town. He needs to buy some irrigation equipment. He's going to start putting that in. And coming back up Dan Road, around about 8, sometime after 8 o'clock, there's still a whole lot of those guys waiting on the side of the road. And he thinks, you know what, it's a huge job. Maybe I should get some more help. Pulls over, same chaos. It's Twister on a whole different level, elbows into cheekbones and kneecaps into bums. And they're on the back of this bakkie. 9 guys this time make it on the back. And he heads off to the plot and drops them off here around about 9-ish. Everyone's getting stuck in, and an hour or two later, the weed eaters run out of fuel. So he grabs jerry cans, he heads to the Shell garage just up the road here, and he's filling the jerry cans for the weed eaters. And 4 individuals approach him with a real humble attitude. They got their hats in their hands, and it's like, "Sir, please, we are desperate for work. It's Christmas time. We haven't got anything. Can you just help us?" And Chris is just moved with compassion, and he says to these 4 guys, "Hey, get in." And he takes them through to that plot, and it's now lunchtime. And these 4 guys get stuck in as well. Now let's roll on to about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Things are looking good, but Chris is a little bit concerned because they're not going to finish in time. There's still so much rubble to clear, and those tunnels arrive tomorrow first thing. So he thinks, you know what, let me gamble, let me try something here, let me go back to Dan Road and see if there are any guys left over. And he does that, and he shoots to Dan Road at the top, and as true as nuts, there are a couple of guys who, in fact, had started getting up, and they were making the long walk back to the township, but he hoots, waves them down and says, "Hey guys, get in." And 7 of them look at one another like, what on earth? It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but I've got nothing to lose, so they jump in the back. They get dropped off at 4 o'clock, and they only work for an hour because 5 o'clock, that plot is clear. It is twilight time. It's looking good. In fact, you've got this whole wad of guys, bunch of guys. They're busy chatting away. They're super excited because it's a job well done. And secondly, they're getting some money to feed their families. And Chris strolls across to those last 7 guys that have just worked for an hour, and he hands them 3 crisp, beautiful pristine 100 Rand notes. 3 for each of them. Now you can imagine the conversation goes up a couple of decibels. There's even more excitement because especially the guys from 7 o'clock in the morning, they're looking at this and thinking, if those guys worked for an hour are getting $300, I wonder what we're about to get. And as Chris moves through the crowd, he's giving each of those guys 300 Rand. And by the time he gets to the last guys who've worked for 10 hours, well, now there's not that much excitement in the chit-chat. There's a bit of grumbling and moaning. And one of them, as a spokesman, says, "Sir, this is not really fair. I mean, those guys work for an hour. We've worked for 10, and we're all getting 300 Rand. And Chris looks at them like, but you agreed to work for 300 Rand, and I can pay whoever I want, how much I want. Now, off you go." Now, if that story bothers you, you're not alone. It bothers me too. And in fact, I think it's bothered every single ear that has heard it in the last 2,000 years. Why does it bother us? Because it sounds so unfair. In fact, one of my favorite authors, Philip Yancey, puts it like this: we are bothered by the scandalous mathematics of grace. What a line. We're bothered by the scandalous mathematics of grace. In other words, it just doesn't add up. It just sounds so unfair. And in fact, that's one of the parables. We could have picked another one. How about the prodigal son who behaves like a real idiot? He blows the inheritance, and when he comes home, his dad throws a party, gives him a new wardrobe, buys him a Ferrari, and here's the brother who's been working diligently the whole time. Or how about the servant that runs into debt to $6 billion? By the time you've equated the gold from the old times and changed it into modern figures, $6 billion. I'm thinking, how on earth does an individual run up debt to? That's a lot of take-a-lot orders. Eskom I can understand, but an individual, that's crazy. And what does that king do? He takes the hit. He takes on the debt. The servant doesn't even pay a single cent. And if you read that story, we don't even see any gratitude from him. It just sounds so unfair. The scandalous mathematics of grace bothers us. And I agree with Philip Yancey on one level, but there's a side where I disagree. Where I agree with him is we are bothered by the unfairness of grace when we see other people getting it. You know that's true deep down inside, even though you'll never admit that. When you see something like this happen, just like that brother of the prodigal son, you bothered, just like those other guys who worked for 10 hours, or just like you in the modern setting, when you see someone getting something they totally don't deserve, it bothers you. But I tell you where it really bothers us, where it really seems unfair, when we find ourselves in a position of having to give it. That bugs us. Where I disagree with Philip Yancey is that it doesn't bug us at all, it doesn't bother us at all when we're on the receiving end of grace. Well, then we're super grateful, or we welcome it, or we're super happy. And sometimes we operate a little bit in dangerous territory where we start justifying why I kind of deserve this grace, even though deep down inside we don't. But other than receiving it, which doesn't bug us, when it involves other people getting it or having to get it from me, well, that really, really bugs us. Now, hold on to that thought for a moment. We're going to come back to that, because I want to look at a rather interesting formula when it comes to Jesus' parables. It's a simple formula. It's not higher grade, and it applies to many of his parables, not all of them, but many of them. There's a simple formula that one of the characters in his story would represent God. And of course, one of the other characters would represent you and I. That's basic formula to many of his stories. And when you hear those parables, or when I hear them or read them, I don't know if this happens to you, but when I identify with one of those human characters, I kind of hope I'm like one of the characters. For example, the Good Samaritan, I kind of hope I'm like that guy. And I'm not like the other two idiots that just walked past that poor guy dying on the side of the road. I kind of think I think I'm like him. Or I kind of hope I'm not like a certain character in the story, even though sometimes deep down inside, I know I can be, or from time to time I am, or just generally I am. I try to not be, but I know I am. I can be like that farmer that is so involved with life here on earth that I don't even give eternity a second thought. Or I can be like that grumpy brother to the prodigal son. Or I can be like that servant from time to time who just buries his treasure, buries his talent because it's just so much easier and more convenient. So there's always this concept of God and a character that's me. And that's the point, because obviously we've got to look for ourselves in those personalities and correct and adjust or grow or self-reflect. So there's a God and there's a me. There's a God who's a good shepherd, and there's me, that's the sheep. There's a God who writes off debt, and there's me that has the debt. There's a God that pays 300 rand, and there's me that feels like I've worked for an hour, I've worked for 10 hours. Or there's a God who sows seeds as a farmer, and there's me who behaves metaphorically like a path, and I just don't listen. Or I get choked up by weeds because the world is just more attractive. Or I really listen, and my life flourishes. So that's the formula. But there's another angle, there's another way to look at these stories that I never really clicked. I never really saw it like that, and maybe you haven't seen it like this either. How do we behave or imitate the character that is God in the story? How do we look at the character that is clearly God and say, how do I do that? How do I follow that example? Now you're sitting here thinking, Mark, that's crazy. I'm not sure that's what Jesus was thinking when he was telling the story. Or, Mark, I'm struggling as it is just to follow the human characters, and now you want me to follow the godlike character in the story. That's a bit of a bridge too far for me. Or maybe you're saying, Mark, I think you might be a bit arrogant. I don't think that's the point of the story. And I would agree with you if it wasn't for a very clear instruction from Jesus. And Paul would reiterate that same instruction a couple of years later. So let's take a listen to what Jesus says. Firstly, in Matthew chapter 5:48, he says, therefore you, who? You, me, therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. How does Paul put this in Ephesians 5? And I want to read it from 3 different translations because I just think it's such a great verse. So let's listen to the NIV first. He says, follow God's example, therefore as dearly loved children. And the NLT says, imitate God. Therefore, in everything you do, what an incredible line, in everything you do, because you are his dear children. And then I love the message. The paraphrase says, watch what God does. Look at those stories. Yes, identify with the character that's clearly you and I, but at the same time, have a look at the character, the personality that is God in that story. Watch what he does, and then you do it. Like children who learn proper behavior from their parents. So in those stories, we look out for God, and we look at God, and we imitate God, and we do what he does. And we pay the guys $300 even if they've just worked for an hour. Unfair, I know. And we write off the debt that someone cannot pay. Unfair, I know. Or when the wayward child comes home, instead of reprimanding, we just throw a party and we buy them a new wardrobe and we buy them a camel. Super unfair. I know. The scandalous mathematics of God's grace. And he says, follow me. Look at those stories and imitate me. Now, Jesus knew, he knew we would struggle with this. He knew it would bother us. So not only has he given us these stories, but then he goes and gives some straight out fundamentally easy, although hard to hear, examples, especially for the first century listener. And he would, and I'm just going to paraphrase these, you can go and check them out for yourself, also in Matthew chapter 5. And he would say to that crowd sitting in the field on the mountainside, now listen, what I want you to do is, if you get slapped, turn the other cheek. Now, we don't even relate much to that, but back in those days, a common individual, a common person, would get slapped quite frequently in Roman times. So they knew exactly what he was talking about. He says, if you get slapped, just turn the other cheek. And if someone forces you to walk a mile, and that's not going to be a pleasant little hike or beautiful stroll. No, one of the commentaries said, in fact, they equated sometimes they were forced to carry Roman soldiers' gear, which would be very heavy. And he says, if they force you to do that for a mile, here's what I want you to do it for 2. That's crazy. And what about this other example of, if they are suing you for your shoes, which, by the way, in the first century was a luxury item. You didn't have a whole lot of shoes to choose from. You only had one pair. If they're taking you to court for your shoes, give them your shoes and give them your coat. That would have been scandalous mathematics of grace for the first century. It would have bothered them. It would have been offensive to their ears. What would be offensive to our ears in the 21st century? Well, when you hear that someone at work has been talking behind your back, things that are so untrue and just so nasty, keep making them tea. When you speak about them, make sure it's positive and only kind. And when that individual who works for you or the company who's stolen from you and then writes off the company vehicle, then takes you to the CCMA, whatever the law requires you to pay him, double it. And when that taxi comes screaming down the emergency lane and then can't get in, make a gap. Let him in. Unfair. I know. Bothers us. I know. So, do we need help with this? I would say, absolutely. Is it difficult? Oh my goodness, I think some of us would be sitting here thinking, it's close to impossible. It's difficult. It bothers us. It sounds unfair. We need help. Where does that help come from? From a God who gives you unfair grace. From a God who says, follow me. Look at those examples in those parables and look at my life. I come as a little baby in a manger. That's super unfair. And in fact, 30-odd years later, I hang on a cross for you. That is super unfair. Imitate me. Follow my example. We live in a world that gives us so many opportunities to dispense grace. Very often those opportunities come in the shape and the form of family and friends. And God doesn't want us to behave tit for tat, eye for eye. He wants us to respond unfairly. His definition of unfair when we are being treated in our definition of unfair. So that's why I'm thinking, I think I need to reintroduce this word of unfair into my home. And say to the girls, hey, how are we going to respond God's unfair to the situation that seems unfair in our eyes? So that if I do buy one a jersey, the other one jumps in and says, Dad, can I contribute? And if I do say to them, listen, won't you take the dishes through to the kitchen? They end up washing them and making tea. And when they see Dad maybe being used and abused, that he responds with generosity and kindness. And they know a particular individual has perhaps been nasty to Mom, but it's okay. Mom still takes him for a cup of coffee or lunch and picks up the bill. Perhaps somewhere somehow at the moment you feel you really have been done in or being treated unfairly, respond unfairly with grace, with the scandalous mathematics of grace, which I know just doesn't seem to add up. And may it be said of us as a family and me as an individual and perhaps you at your funeral one day, on your tombstone one day, that he or she was so moved by God's unfair grace that they couldn't keep it to themselves. This world needs unfair grace. Let's give it, especially in this beautiful Christmas time. Another story of unfair grace. Come, let's pray. God, thank you for your grace. Where would we be if it wasn't for your scandalous mathematics of grace, writing off a debt that I could never pay back? Thank you. But Father, in this precious time, this precious Christmas time, may I be so moved by your unfair grace that I look for opportunities to give it. And where I get treated unfairly as the world defines unfairly, may I respond with your definition of unfair in grace. Amen. Bless you.